Chapter 11. What are they good for? The soul is healed by being with children. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Camellia tried to ignore the growing agony. This was not the time. The lights flickered for the third time since she had begun surgery on a badly wounded America Reborn soldier. He was young, maybe 19 at most, and had tried to make a name for himself by rushing a small settlement a few miles to the east. Like the America Reborn group, their target had chosen an old campground and was just a little more successful at farming than the AR. Small surprise there. The only thing these idiots know how to do is shoot guns and run their mouths about coloreds, Camellia thought to herself. The raid had been a failure. 2 men dead, this one on her table badly hurt, and no food to show for it. As much as she hated him, Camellia knew that if Selwyn hadn't held Cooper back from the raid, it would have probably been successful. Alanush had heard that the other settlement, in addition to the crime of sheltering a black, colored family, had also had a small herd of goats. Meat was in short supply these days, and Camellia's mouth watered at the thought of it. "I need those lights to stay on," she snapped. If she could just get the artery sutured closed, he would have a chance. If he hadn't lost too much blood, that is. The lights flickered a 4th time, and her belly rippled, agonizing pain shooting into her buttocks, up her back and down her legs. She didn't have much more time before. She bent over in agony, her sight temporarily blurring. "What's wrong with you?" Alanush hissed in panic. Blood still terrified her, and despite a year of training, she couldn't even handle a simple surgery without turning green at the gills. Camellia would have laughed if it weren't for the agony she felt. Selwyn sure knew how to pick them. Her belly twisted again, and her sight blurred. It had been a hard pregnancy. She'd been sick for more than 5 months, barely able to keep food down, and then when it had finally subsided, she had dealt with more difficulties. She glared at the fool girl who had been sent to her to learn doctoring. Selwyn had turned her over to Camellia only because Alanush was completely hopeless at warfare, guns, or much of anything else. Months before, while handling a gun in weapons training, she had accidentally shot and killed her training partner. Selwyn had been disgusted with her, but stuck her with Camellia as a last resort. Like the rest, she had taken on a white name. At 18, Alanush Swiftblade wasn't very swift with any kind of blade, and looked as if she were close to vomiting. Camellia snapped at the girl. "I'm in labor, you fool. Now hold this clamp and don't move." When her condition had become apparent, Selwyn had summoned her, questioned her at length, and although she was tempted to tell him who the father was, she was far more frightened of what would happen to her if she did. Cooper had already firmly entrenched himself into the America Reborn's leadership. He would find a way to hurt her or the baby who hadn't had a choice in any of this. Add to that severe leg swelling, back pain, and spiking blood pressure, Camellia would count herself lucky if she managed to keep this baby. Selwyn had not been pleased, and he had looked positively enraged when she blithely replied, "Immaculate conception." If the America Reborn group hadn't needed her doctoring skills so badly, he probably would have had her shot where she stood. As it was, he had knocked her to the ground with a sharp crack of his open palm on the side of her head. She gathered her strength as another massive contraction hit, breathed through it, and then focused on the man on the table. The lights flickered on and off twice more before she was finished. It looked as if the generator was going out, or that the AR had managed to steal a batch of bad gas on their last raid. Either was possible, and by the time she finished with the AR soldier on the table, she was in too much pain to care. Hours later, Alanush washed and swaddled the tiny red-faced baby, while Camellia cleaned herself up. The child was quiet. He had barely cried when he was born, and was staring about in wide-eyed wonder at the new world he found himself in. This quiet demeanor would serve him well and allow him to survive the years to come. Alanush, known once upon a time as Trudy Denkins, smiled at the baby and cooed at him. She wasn't a complicated girl, rather simple-minded, really, which made Selwyn's choice to establish her as the next doctor so laughable in Camelia's eyes. She wasn't even as rabidly racist as most of them, and was delighted with the baby. "He's beautiful, Camelia, and he's not so brown-skinned like you," the girl said, smiling, truly unaware of how unbelievably stupid she sounded. "He could pass for white." "Could he now?" Camelia's response was dry. "Oh, yes," the girl replied, then cooed again at the baby. Her admiration of the infant was interrupted by a voice at the doorway. "So this is what has everyone in a dither," Scott Cooper said, leaning against the frame. Camelia felt a line of fear run through her. "Is there something you need, Cooper?" she asked as evenly as possible. She reached out and took the baby from Alanush. He was so impossibly tiny in her arms, so perfect. His eyes flickered over the child for a brief moment, taking in the dark hair and eyes, the pale skin. The boy was several shades more pale than Camelia's bronze skin. "What are they good for, anyway?" Camelia wouldn't respond. She couldn't. This man had given her a baby, but it certainly wasn't out of love or even kindness. He obviously cared nothing for children. He had told her as much, told her that there had been other women who showed, and that he had ended their lives. The fact that she was the only doctor, and therefore under Selwyn's protection, however limited that might be, meant that he hadn't killed her. But he had warned her that if she told, thereby endangering him and his progress inching up the racist neo-Nazi group ladder, that he would end her life and the baby's. Selwyn had suspected that Cooper was the father of the baby. It wouldn't do for Selwyn's new right-hand man to be coupling with a disease-infested colored spick, especially since his precious daughter Delwyn had professed an interest in pairing with him. It was why he had held Cooper back from the last 2 raids, which had had devastating results. 3 men dead, 1 badly injured, and 2 horses lost to the group. The men had grown to depend on Cooper's tactical knowledge and fought well under him. Without him, they fell into a state of disorganization worse than they were before his arrival. Cooper strode into the room and with one quick move pulled the baby from Camelia's arms. She screamed, "Wait!" She thought a moment and then blurted out, "I'm not telling you who the father is, but if you kill my baby, you can just forget about me doctoring another person, because I won't do it. That's my price. Let him live, let me care for him, and I'll keep doctoring." She felt a presence in the doorway, but ignored it. "I swear to you, I'll help no one if you hurt my baby. He's mine." Selwyn spoke from the doorway. "Give her back, the little brat." He glared at her. "Threaten me again, and I'll kill you and your half-breed runt. Caring for it had better not affect your doctoring or any other duties." And he walked away, satisfied that Cooper couldn't be the father. Otherwise, why would she have said to Cooper she wasn't going to tell him who the baby daddy was? For all he knew, it could have been one of those idiots who had died on recent raids. Cooper was clean. It looked as if Delwyn would get what she wanted after all. Inside the room, Cooper gave the tiny bundle back to Camelia, gave her a cold smile, and left the room. She released a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding until that moment. He was hers. She could keep him. She looked down into his warm brown eyes, his perfect face and soft, downy black hair. Hers. Alanush moved closer and touched the tiny patch of soft, downy hair on his tiny head. "What are you going to name him?" Camelia's thoughts turned to a memory of a smiling Hispanic man, standing outside her car window, with soft black hair and warm brown eyes. The rifle strapped to his back was unusual, but then again the whole trip from New York had been surreal. Military everywhere. Helicopters and unusual military aircraft filling the skies, checkpoints and questions about where she was heading and long stares at her scars. She had answered them all calmly. "I'm heading to Texas, and I've been offered a nursing position there." The nursing home was filled with a mixture of elderly residents and a special wing for burn victims. The perfect place for her, she had thought. A place she could fit in and not be stared at every day. "Run out of gas?" he had asked her. "Yes, it looks like it. I hoped I could make it to the next gas station. The ATMs were all down, and none of the bigger gas stations were willing to take my credit card," she had said to him. "I turned off the main roads, hoping to find a smaller place, but..." She tried not to feel nervous. After all, he didn't have the rifle in his hands. "I'm Armando," he had said, reaching out a hand. "Armando Velasquez." She had taken his hand, shook it, and then he had said, "I'm really sorry I can't help with the gas. There's been nothing but shortages in the area, but my house is just up the hill there." He pointed and continued, "If you like, you could try calling someone to come pick you up." "There's really no one to call." She realized as the words were coming out how bad that sounded. What if he were some crazy serial killer? "I mean, I was headed to Texas, and..." She stopped when she saw the man shake his head and look sick. "What?" "It's just that I heard over the emergency radio, well, there's been a nuke in Austin," Armando told her. "What? That's... I mean, it's impossible. You can't be serious. What? Who?" She stopped and took a breath, struggling to conceptualize a nuke inside U.S. borders. Why would someone do that? Armando shrugged. "I don't know. Things have been getting rather scary in the last few days. The military is putting up barricades, shutting down borders to the southern states. It looks as if, well, as if the United States is at war." "With who?" "With itself." Camellia stood by the side of her car in shock. 1,000 questions raced through her head. Eventually, she let him help her move the car off of the road and bring her bags, and eventually her boxes of books and other necessities she couldn't live without, up to his large, sturdy home. There they would listen to the increasingly bizarre news reports on the emergency radio. Armando lived there alone. He was a widower, his wife having died in a car crash several years before. Slowly, she told him the story of her scars, the remains of what extensive plastic surgery could not fix. She had survived the Amtrak train bombings when so many others had perished. The scars, she said, were a testament to her will to survive. He had touched them, ran long, gentle fingers over the ridge of scars on her face, and told her she was beautiful, inside and out. She had stayed in his house, and they had fallen in love, quietly survived the chaos in the secluded mountain retreat. They had soon welcomed 2 more Hispanic families when the sentiments of the area had turned ugly and desperate. A racist group, a leftover of the American Nazi Party, had been blaming the war and the nuke in Austin on Mexico. Between shortages of food, no power, and an intermittent water supply, the few Hispanic families in the area stuck out like sore thumbs. They had banded together, worked the land, traded with those who weren't spouting racist rhetoric, and kept to themselves. Camellia hated the memories of those last few moments, when the America Reborn group had attacked them without provocation, seeking to rob them of what little food and supplies they had. Armando had fought. All of them had. When Maria, the smiling, round-cheeked mother of 2 teenage boys, had fallen, though, Camellia had laid down her gun and got to doctoring. She had tried in vain to save the woman who had come to be her closest friend and confidant next to Armando. After that, the boys, Maria's husband, even Armando had fallen while she was busy trying to save Carlos, a young newlywed. As she worked, the southern wall was on fire, the fire set by the attackers. The America Reborn soldiers had grabbed supplies, ripped the medical supplies from the table next to her, and even the needle and thread from her hand after Solwyn stopped them from shooting her, seeing her medical expertise in action. She had been a fine ER nurse prior to the bombings, but scars like hers scared the patients too much. She had screamed and fought them, even as they pulled her from the burning building and past Armando's lifeless body. She had kicked them, bit at them, and tried to get away, until a hard punch had knocked her out and carried her away into the darkness, away from everyone she had come to love. And here she had been ever since, nothing better than a slave, nothing more than a tool to be used at the whim of America Reborn. Until now. Tears came then, as she held the infant in her arms. How she and Armando had tried to have a baby, despite the troubles surrounding them. Armando had called it an act of faith, that the world would get better, that life would return to normal. But each month, there was such disappointment, no matter how often she prayed for just one chance. She stared at the baby's beautiful brown eyes, and saw instead the eyes of the kindest man she had ever known, reaching out to brush her hair from her face and tell her she was beautiful, telling her that the scars didn't matter to him. You should have been his. She turned to Alanush. His name is Armando, she said.